Stop throwing your hair in the trash. That little wad of hair you pull off your brush every morning and drop in the garbage? You're throwing away one of the richest plant foods. There is something your tomato plants would just about beg for if they could. That neighbor with the tomatoes so big and red, they almost look fake every summer. They're not paying for some fancy bottle off the garden center shelf. They just know a simple, old backyard trick that costs nothing. A plain handful of hair, the kind you've been tossing for years, turned into the biggest, healthiest tomatoes on the block. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how to do it yourself. You'll also learn the 3 mistakes that can quietly ruin the whole thing, because get even one of them wrong, and you'll do more harm than good. So stick around to the end. Hair? Feeding your tomatoes? It sounds strange, sure. But once you see what hair does down in the soil, it starts to make perfect sense. So why would a plain handful of hair do anything at all for a tomato plant? Well, it all comes down to what hair is actually made of. The number one thing a tomato needs to grow big, leafy, and green, to push out all that thick, strong growth that holds up a heavy load of fruit, is the very same thing hair is absolutely packed with, and not just a little bit. Pound for pound, hair holds somewhere around 50 times more of it than the same amount of cow manure. 50 times. Now, that sounds almost too big to believe, so here's the proof. This isn't some old wives' tale passed along over the back fence. A university lab actually went and measured it. But that's not where it ends. Hair also carries a small mineral that helps your tomatoes form up clean and strong on the bottom. You know that ugly black sunken spot that shows up right when a tomato's almost ready to pick the one that ruins the whole fruit and just breaks your heart? Hair may help lower the chances of that, especially when your watering and your soil are already in good shape. It won't fix a watering problem on its own, but it gives your plant a little extra support against it. And here's the part folks fall in love with. A store-bought feed gives your plant one big rush all at once, then washes right out of your soil after a watering or two, and just like that, it's gone. And you're back to buying more. Hair doesn't work like that. Hair lets go of its food slow and steady, just a little at a time, week after week. So your plant keeps right on eating, long after everybody else's feeding has worn off and quit on them. So if hair is this good for your tomatoes, why doesn't everybody just bury a handful and call it a day? Because there's one trick to it. One. And if you skip it, this whole thing falls apart. But first, real quick. If you love simple little tricks like this one, I've put together a whole book full of them. You'll find the link right at the top of the comments and down in the description below, so go ahead and grab it whenever you like. Alright now, about that trick. Here's the whole secret. And it's so simple that almost nobody bothers to get it right. You have to cut the hair up small, real small, before it ever touches your soil. Now, tossing in a whole clump of long hair feels a whole lot easier. Just grab it and drop it in the hole, right? But here's the thing to understand. Long strands of hair behave nothing like short little bits once they're down in the ground. Nothing alike at all. And that one difference is the whole line between a tomato plant that thrives and one that just sits there and struggles all summer long. When you chop that hair down small, and that means smaller than a grain of rice, everything changes. Now your soil, and all those tiny living things working away down in it, can finally get a real grip on it. They can start breaking it down bit by bit, and turning it into food your plant can actually drink up. That one little step, that's the whole ballgame. It's what turns hair from a slow, stubborn lump just sitting there doing nothing, into a steady stream of food feeding your tomato roots all season long. Now, skip that step, and you don't just get a little less out of your hair. You can actually do some real harm to that plant. So here's exactly what goes wrong. When you bury long, uncut hair down by your tomato, it doesn't feed that plant, it works against it. And the saddest part of the whole thing is that most folks never once figure out why their tomatoes slowly went downhill. So here's exactly what happens under there. All those long strands tangle and weave and mat together underground into a tight, matted clump. Picture a wet, matted mess where the water just beads up and rolls right off the top of it instead of soaking on down through. That's the kind of thing forming down around your poor roots. And that mat causes 2 problems at the same time. First, it keeps your water from moving evenly down to the roots that are sitting there thirsty for it. And second, it traps stale, stagnant air down in there around them. And that combination, fresh water held up top, dead air trapped down below, well, that's exactly the kind of trouble that can leave roots weak, wet, and struggling instead of growing strong. This right here is why so many good, hard-working folks try the hair trick, watch their plant struggle along and fade, and walk away swearing up and down that the whole thing is a bunch of nonsense. But the truth is, It works just fine. They simply skip the one little step that makes it safe. Now, there's one more way to ruin this. And this one isn't about how you use the hair, it's about which hair you reach for in the first place. Get this one wrong, and you can actually poison your own soil. Here's the hard truth. Not all hair is safe to put anywhere near your garden, and using the wrong kind can quietly kill off the good life in your soil, and even taint the very tomatoes you're planning to slice up and eat. So here's what to watch out for. Hair that's been colored, permed, or chemically straightened carries leftover chemicals locked up inside it. And those chemicals don't just politely disappear the moment the hair goes in the ground. No, they soak right down into your soil and stick around, and they can wipe out the earthworms and all those tiny helpers that keep your dirt alive and healthy in the first place. Lose those, and you've lost the whole engine that makes good soil good. And it gets worse than that. Some of those leftover chemicals throw the whole balance of your soil so far off kilter that your plant can't even pull up the food that's already sitting right there waiting for it. So it just sits yellow, stunted, going absolutely nowhere no matter what you try to do for it. So here's the safe rule, and it's about as simple as a rule can get. Only ever use plain, natural, untreated hair. The kind right off your own hairbrush in the morning. Or a free handful swept up from a regular old barber shop. Most barbers are happy to let you take it off their hands. And skip anything that's been through a salon chemical treatment, anything at all. That one rule right there keeps you out of trouble every single time. So now you know what to use, and what to stay well away from. Here's how to do it, step by step, so you get it right the very first time. Done right. This whole thing is just a few easy steps. No special tools. No money out of your pocket. Nothing complicated about it. Start small. Take just a couple of handfuls of that plain, natural hair and chop it up nice and small, smaller than a grain of rice, remember. And go easy here. You're feeding the soil a little something, not stuffing a pillow under your plant. A gentle hand wins every time with this. Next, mix that chopped up hair into your compost pile, along with some dry leaves and a little bit of manure. And here's the rule that keeps you out of trouble. The hair should never be more than a small share of the whole pile. For one big armful of leaves and scraps, just a couple of handfuls of hair is plenty. That's all, no more. Now, that little bit of manure works just like a jump start on a cold morning. It gets the hair breaking down in a few short weeks, instead of dragging on for months. And that time spent sitting in the pile? That's the very thing that makes the hair gentle and safe to use around your tomatoes. Then, once it's all broken down and ready, work just a handful or two of that finished compost right into each planting hole, about 6 to 8 inches deep, a couple of weeks before you ever set your tomato plant in. That way, those roots grow straight down into a steady supply of food, sitting there waiting just for them. And one last word on how much. For a regular backyard bed, a little goes a long, long way here. You're talking about a light touch through the compost, not bags and bags of the stuff. Even across a good-sized backyard bed, you only need a light amount mixed through the compost. Not bags and bags, not a thick layer. Just a little, spread out well. So go light, and let that soil do the rest. Now, before you go running off to bury every last hair in the house, there are a couple of honest truths you need to hear. Because this is not some magic overnight fix, and it'd be plain wrong to pretend otherwise. So here's the honest part. Plain and simple, neighbor to neighbor, over the fence. This is not the trick for somebody who wants a miracle by next weekend. It's just not. This is the trick for the gardener who wants that same tomato bed getting richer and stronger year after year. And a whole lot of the real magic here doesn't even show up that very first season. It shows up in your second year, and your third when your bed is still feeding your plants strong and steady, long after a store-bought feed would have quit on you months ago. In fact, university farm trials found roots growing about a third bigger, with that same soil still feeding plants season after season. Now, one more honest thing. Hair is rich in some things, but it runs a little light in others, so it works its very best as part of a team. Pair it up with a little bone meal, or a handful of plain wood ash, and now your plant's got the full menu it needs to really load up with fruit. And this right here is the real secret behind those jaw-dropping tomatoes on the block that started this whole thing. It was never one lucky season. It was never some magic bottle off a shelf. It's just a patient gardener, quietly feeding their soil, year after year, so that dirt keeps getting richer and those tomatoes just keep getting bigger. So there it is. That's the trick that's been hiding in your hairbrush this whole entire time. Just think about where you started today. You came into this, figuring that hair belonged in the trash can, Plain and simple. End of story. And now here you are, walking away with a free, proven way to feed your soil that the folks down at the garden center will just never, ever tell you about. And that's the real beauty of it, isn't it? This is exactly the kind of old, almost forgotten trick that quietly built the finest gardens on the whole street, taking something everybody else throws away without a thought and turning it into something every neighbor envies. So if you're going to give this a try this season, do yourself a favor and drop a note down in the comments. Let everyone know how it turns out for you. And be sure to stick around, because next time, we're settling the big argument once and for all. Does hair really keep the deer and the rabbits out of your garden for good? Or is that just a tall tale gardeners love to tell each other? You won't want to miss that one.